Redditor 1. I've never told anyone this before, but there was about a week, when I saw things in the sky that shook me to my core. It was during late summer, when the nights were warm and the stars shone with an intensity that only a rural stretch can muster. For 7 long nights, something inexplicable happened. I started noticing these objects in the sky that looked like satellites at first, but their behavior was anything but ordinary. They moved erratically, darting around like a swarm of fireflies, but with a precision that suggested purpose. I became known around town as the UFO guy, a title I neither asked for nor truly believed in, yet one that clung to me like a shadow. It all began on a balmy evening after work. I had just stepped out of the local diner where I'd grabbed a quick burger and fries because the day had been a grind, and was walking back to my truck along a quiet stretch of highway. The sky was nearly cloudless, and the Milky Way spilled across the heavens like a river of stars. As I walked, I noticed a series of bright, pulsating lights in the distance. At first, I dismissed them as satellites. After all, I've seen hundreds of those in my life. But these weren't the satellites I knew. They moved with fluid, almost organic motions, sometimes lingering in one spot before zipping off at speeds that defied logic. It was like watching a swarm of fireflies, only these were far too large and purposeful. For nearly a week, these sightings became the centerpiece of my evenings. I'd step outside every night, sometimes alone, sometimes with a friend, and just watch in silent awe as these lights performed their enigmatic dance across the sky. There was a sort of intelligence in the way they moved, as if they were communicating with one another or surveying something beneath them. I couldn't explain it, and no one in our small town really had an explanation either. Most people laughed it off, calling me overly imaginative or a conspiracy nut, but I knew what I had seen. Then came the family reunion, a long-anticipated camping trip with relatives I hadn't seen in years. We gathered around a crackling campfire under a sky as clear as polished glass. As the night wore on, the air filled with playful banter and light-hearted teasing. Naturally, someone began joking about my UFO sightings. The teasing was relentless, and I took it in stride, my tone even tinged with the self-deprecating humor of someone who had been labeled the UFO guy. Amid the laughter, I could feel my cheeks burning, and for a brief moment, I wondered if the universe would let me off the hook for once. Barely 2 minutes into a particularly raucous joke about cosmic visitors, everything changed. Without any warning, right above our circle of flickering firelight, a massive object appeared in the sky. It was exactly as I had described all those nights. A large, unidentified flying object, gliding silently. In that moment, the humor died, and a deep silence fell over our group. With all the bravado I could muster, I pointed upward and said, "Just like that, right there." My voice, steady and clear, cut through the shocked silence that followed. No one spoke after that. No more jokes, no more teasing. I felt vindicated, even though the terror of what I had witnessed mingled with a strange exhilaration. After that night, my UFO sightings became a subject of hushed conversations and skeptical glances at work. I am by nature a very skeptical person. While I believe that the vastness of the universe suggests we are not alone, most UFO sightings can be explained by mundane causes. In my opinion, 99% of the time, these phenomena are nothing more than atmospheric anomalies or misidentified human-made objects. Yet, what I saw during that week and that unforgettable night at the reunion defied simple explanations. Unlike the satellites I'd seen before, these objects accelerated and decelerated with speeds that were simply phenomenal. Their movements were too deliberate, too coordinated to be a random glitch of physics. I started to wonder, could it be a black project? Some new, not public technology being tested in our skies? Or maybe something else entirely, something that belonged to a realm of existence that we can only speculate about. The more I tried to rationalize it, the more I realized that sometimes the universe holds secrets that are meant to be experienced rather than explained. At work, I'd often catch my colleagues glancing at me with a mixture of amusement and disbelief whenever I mentioned another strange sighting. "Oh, here comes the UFO guy again," they'd say. I'd smile wryly and shrug it off, though inside I was constantly replaying the events in my mind. Those nights, under a vast canvas of stars, have left a mark on me that I cannot erase. I still remember the hum of the night air, the gentle rustle of leaves, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched by something immense and unknowable. I sometimes sit on my back porch in the quiet hours of the night and gaze upward, my thoughts drifting to that family reunion. The memory of the campfire's warmth, the sound of laughter abruptly silenced by that awe-inspiring appearance, is as vivid as if it happened last week. I recall how the fire's glow danced on the faces of my relatives, casting long, flickering shadows, and then, in one miraculous moment, the sky revealed its secret. I remember the cool night air, the sharp contrast between the gentle murmur of the woods and the silent, majestic object overhead. That night, as I stood there, feeling both vindicated and unnerved, I couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, the universe had chosen me for something extraordinary. The idea that these objects might be intelligent, that their movements were not random but a form of communication, both terrified and fascinated me. Even now, I still ponder the possibilities. What if the glowing shapes I've seen are not alien invaders but messengers, signals from a realm that exists parallel to our own? Every time I recall those nights, my heart beats a little faster. I remember the first time I saw that huge triangular object that flew behind a small cloud, disappearing as if it were never there. I remember the moment when the hovering lights swarmed like a flock of fireflies, moving with a precision that hinted at a purpose. And I remember that family reunion, when laughter turned to stunned silence as an identical UFO crossed the sky, leaving me with a sense of awe and a dash of fear that I couldn't shake. I sometimes question whether any of it was real or if I was simply caught in a web of my own overactive imagination. But the details are too specific. The way the objects accelerated, the patterns they formed, the eerie silence that accompanied them. I've seen hundreds of satellites before, but nothing like these. There was a deliberateness to their movement, an intelligence that I can't explain. Now, I continue to look up at the sky with a cautious curiosity. I live in a small town where every night offers a clear view of the cosmos, and while I try to convince myself that most of what I see has a logical explanation, I can't ignore the memories that keep surfacing. I am still the UFO guy in the eyes of some, though now I view the title with a mix of skepticism and wonder. I have no concrete answers, but I hold on to the possibility that there are secrets in the vastness of space, waiting to be uncovered. So, as I sit here at night with the distant hum of the world below and the stars flickering like distant campfires, I find comfort in the mystery. Maybe I'll get home soon and write down every detail for anyone who might care. For now, though, I'll just keep watching, keep wondering, and remember that one unforgettable week, when the universe spoke in lights and I listened. Redditor 2. I've never told anyone this before, but when I was a kid, I used to spend summer nights playing by the woods behind our house, catching fireflies and imagining adventures. We lived out in the middle of nowhere, a half-hour drive from the nearest town, so the woods were vast and mysterious, and the night sky, a glittering canopy of stars, always filled me with wonder. I remember one particular night vividly, a night that changed everything I thought I knew about the world. It was late, well past dusk, and I had been playing near the tree line with a battered net and a jar, trying to catch those elusive, flickering lights. The cool summer air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and every crackle and rustle in the underbrush seemed amplified in the quiet. I was so engrossed in my game that I barely noticed the sound at first. A series of sticks breaking in the distance. My heart skipped a beat, and I listened intently, convinced it might be a wild turkey. I was absolutely obsessed with turkeys, even though they weren't common around here. I remember thinking, maybe I'll see one up close. I was a dumb kid, I suppose, but that thought filled me with excitement. I remember the sound growing louder, a steady crunch that wasn't like any animal I knew. Suddenly, an inexplicable surge of adrenaline hit me, just like the feeling I got before I was about to be punished for a misdeed. My body tensed and my legs carried me as fast as they could toward the source of the noise, away from the safety of our small house. I sprinted toward the dark line of trees that bordered the yard, my mind racing with both curiosity and a growing dread. As I reached the edge of the woods, I slowed to a stop. The only sound was my own frantic breathing and the pounding of my heart. I pressed myself against a rough, moss-covered trunk, peering into the inky darkness. My eyes darted along the tree line, searching desperately for the cause of the eerie sound. Then, in the dim half-light, I saw them. Two bright eyes, like those of a cat glinting in the darkness. They were small, about the size of a baseball, and positioned roughly 3 feet above the ground. Unlike the stereotypical menacing glare from movie monsters, these eyes were wide, unblinking, and strangely innocent. Yet they sent a chill racing down my spine. I froze, every muscle locked in terror. I felt like prey, as if some colossal creature were sizing me up, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, those piercing eyes began to move upward along the trunk. I watched, transfixed, as the dark silhouette of the creature emerged from the shadows. In a few agonizing seconds, it rose until it stood at about 6 feet tall. I could barely comprehend its size. It was huge, bigger than anything I had ever seen in the woods. The creature's outline was blurred by the dim light, but one detail seared itself into my memory. As it continued to rise, its lips slowly pulled back from its teeth in a silent, grotesque snarl. I don't know what possessed me to do next, but the fear was too overwhelming. I hauled ass, running as fast as I could back toward the house. My little legs carried me along the familiar path, each step a frantic plea for safety. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door behind me as if it could shut out the terror outside. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. I burst into the kitchen where my dad was making a late-night snack. Between sobs and gasps, I tried to tell him what I had seen. "There was something in the woods," I managed, my voice trembling uncontrollably. "I saw eyes. And then a huge creature, with a snarl so scary it looked like its lips were pulled back from its teeth." I insisted that it was not a turkey, that something much bigger and more sinister was out there. Instead of the concern I expected, my dad's face twisted into a mixture of annoyance and disbelief. He barked at me. "You're lying. Stop making up stories." And without further discussion, he took a paddle and gave me a spanking that burned more than just my skin. I remember that punishment all too well. The sting of the paddle, the humiliation of being called a liar, and the crushing weight of isolation as my truth was dismissed. In the days that followed, I struggled with the memory. At school, the incident became a whispered secret among my friends, some of whom insisted they'd seen odd things in the woods too, while others just laughed it off. But I knew what I had seen. I replayed the moment in my head. The sound of cracking sticks that wasn't wild turkey, the surge of adrenaline as I ran into the darkness, the cold sweat that dripped down my back as I froze in terror, and those eyes, those unblinking, haunting eyes that marked the moment I realized I was being watched. Years have passed since that night, but the memory still lingers, an indelible scar on my consciousness. Sometimes, when I'm walking near the woods as an adult, I feel that same prickling sense of being observed. I try to rationalize it away. Maybe it was just an animal, a stray dog, or even a reflection of my own fear in the darkness. Yet, every so often, I catch a glimpse of something that makes my heart race with that old, raw terror. I still find myself wondering about that creature. Was it really a wild animal, or was it something altogether otherworldly, a secret of the woods that I was never meant to understand? Late at night, when the world is asleep and the only sounds are the rustling leaves and distant calls of nocturnal creatures, I sometimes stand by my window and stare into the darkness, hoping against hope to see a flash of those mesmerizing eyes again. I've come to accept that some mysteries remain unsolved, that the truth of that night might be locked away in the secret corners of the forest, far beyond the reach of my understanding. Even now, I can still feel the shiver down my spine when I think back to that moment. The image of those two bright, unblinking eyes that rose slowly from the darkness, and the horrifying glimpse of a creature too large to be anything ordinary. The memory is a constant reminder of the fragile boundary between safety and terror, between the known world and the unimaginable. I often wonder if, in the quiet whispers of the night, that creature still roams the woods, its presence hidden in the shadows, waiting for another unsuspecting soul to cross its path. And so I carry that night with me, an everlasting echo of fear, wonder, and the painful sting of a truth that was never believed. I know I'll never forget the sensation of being hunted by those eerie eyes, nor the adrenaline-fueled rush of terror that forced me to run as fast as I could back to the safety of my home. It remains a secret kept between me and the silent, haunted woods. A secret that, despite the passing of years, still makes my heart race whenever I hear the rustle of leaves in the dark. Redditor 3. I've never told anyone this before, but during my deployment to Afghanistan, I experienced something that still haunts me. It was a night like any other. Endless hours spent watching a small, unmanned aerial vehicle, Raven, glide silently over a rugged, unforgiving landscape. My task was simple: help the operator use the infrared camera to scout for insurgents planting roadside bombs. Most nights were uneventful, a monotonous routine punctuated by static-filled chatter over the comms and the drone's low, steady hum. But one night, everything changed. It was around 2:30 a.m. The desert was cold, and the darkness was almost absolute, broken only by the faint glimmer of distant stars and the ghostly glow of our screens. I sat in the cramped, makeshift control tent, the cool air of the desert seeping through the thin fabric walls. I remember the subtle taste of dust and the persistent hum of the generators that powered our equipment. We were deep in a remote area, far from any town, and the isolation was almost palpable. That night, as I monitored the IR feed on my specialized Toughbook, something caught my eye. A circular hot spot in the corner of the camera's view. At first, I dismissed it as another false positive, a random glitch in the thermal feed, but it was different. I leaned closer, adjusting the camera's pan and tilt controls to get a better view. The object was featureless, yet striking. A perfectly round sphere, glowing white, hot around its outer edge with a deep, cold black center, as if it were a burning ring with a void at its heart. I could feel my pulse quicken. "What in the heck is that?" I muttered under my breath, my voice barely audible over the static of the comm system. I exchanged a quick glance with the operator. He was a seasoned guy, calm and measured even in the face of the most bizarre sightings. He didn't say much. His eyes were glued to the screen, and he simply nodded, as if to confirm my own disbelief. For a full 5 minutes, that circular hotspot hung motionless in the IR view. In that frozen moment, time seemed to slow down. I still remember how the temperature readings on the screen spiked unnaturally high along the outer rim of the object, while the center remained a void of darkness, a cold black that defied the expected thermal gradient. I told myself, this has to be a glitch, but deep down, something in my gut screamed that it was not. Then, without warning, the sphere's behavior changed. It began to accelerate, rapidly descending nearly to the ground. I could almost feel the shift in the air on the control panel, a subtle change that made my fingers tremble as I gripped the sides of my desk. The operator's voice came through calmly, but there was an edge to it. "Lock it in. Track it." I watched in disbelief as the object moved with a speed that was both terrifying and inexplicable. Then, just as suddenly, it shot back up into the sky, disappearing out of the Raven's range in an instant. We immediately called up the Tactical Operations Center. "We've got something, an unidentified object," I reported, my voice betraying a mix of awe and apprehension. The TOC's response was dismissive, cold. They insisted it must have been a glitch, nothing more. A random error in the sensor feed. They even mentioned there was nothing unusual on satellite view in that area, but the memory of that 5-minute spectacle was seared into my mind. After the call, we rushed to review the recorded footage on our Toughbook. My hands were shaking as I navigated through the files, expecting to see that mysterious sphere in all its horrifying detail. But as I played the video, a sinking feeling filled me. The entire 5 minutes during which the UFO had been present were missing. It was as if the footage had been erased, or the file had been corrupted beyond retrieval. I stared at the blank segment on the screen, heart pounding, unable to reconcile the loss of evidence with what I had just witnessed. That night, and in the days following, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that white, hot circle with its dark, empty core. A perfect, featureless sphere that defied the laws of physics. I found myself questioning everything I had learned about technology and nature. Could it be some new, undisclosed technology? A black project gone rogue? or something far more extraordinary, a genuine encounter with an intelligence beyond our understanding. I tried to rationalize it all during brief moments of quiet. I recalled the countless hours we spent scanning the dark desert, looking for the mundane heat signatures of insurgents. Yet here was something that didn't match any known signature. The sphere had an eerie calmness, its movements deliberate and controlled, almost as if it were aware of us watching. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, and my throat tightened as I replayed the event in my mind, over and over, trying to find a clue that would explain its existence. At work, my colleagues noticed my unusual silence in the following days. I couldn't bring myself to share the details, not in the sterile environment of a military office. Instead, I muttered vague references to sensor anomalies and glitches when questioned. But deep down, I was tormented by what I had seen. I spent nights poring over declassified reports and research articles on UFO phenomena, desperate for some kind of rational explanation. Every theory I encountered, be it a malfunction in the IR camera, atmospheric interference, or an experimental piece of equipment, seemed too mundane to account for the sheer intensity and deliberate movement of that object. The absence of the footage on our Tough book became a puzzle that haunted me. I questioned the integrity of our systems and even considered the possibility that someone had tampered with the data. But the TOC's explanation was curt and unyielding. It was a sensor glitch. And yet, I couldn't shake the certainty that what we had seen was something real, something inexplicable. I remember one late night in particular, when the desert was exceptionally still and the stars hung like frozen diamonds in the sky. I sat in the makeshift control room, the only sound the hum of the air conditioner and the distant rumble of military convoys on the highway. In that eerie silence, I kept thinking about that missing footage, about how the evidence of our encounter had simply evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a memory and a deep sense of unease. I even started to wonder if that sphere had been watching us as much as we had been watching it, a silent observer from another realm. Even now, years later, I often find myself staring up at the night sky, searching for a hint of that brilliant, white-hot light. I wonder if it was a once-in-a-lifetime event, or if the cosmos continues to hide such secrets just out of reach. My skepticism remains intact. 99% of UFO sightings can be explained by natural phenomena or human error, but there's a nagging 1% that refuses to be rationalized. That fraction, that sliver of possibility, is enough to keep me awake at night. I sometimes share my experience with a select few who I trust, and their reactions are always a mix of incredulity and hushed curiosity. One coworker, a grizzled veteran with a skeptical eye, simply shook his head and muttered, "You're overthinking it," as if trying to dismiss my memories with a wave of his hand. But in the quiet moments, when I'm alone with my thoughts, I can still feel that overwhelming presence, the cold, empty center of that glowing sphere, and the chilling realization that some things in the universe are far more mysterious than we dare to believe. I've come to accept that I might never have all the answers. Perhaps that night was a rare intersection of advanced, secret technology and a cosmic phenomenon that our current understanding can't fully capture. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a genuine encounter with something that exists beyond our comprehension, a silent, deliberate visitor from a realm we are only beginning to imagine. Every time I review my mental log of that night, the rhythmic hum of the drone, the cold desert air, the unsettling disappearance of the footage, I feel that same pulse of fear and wonder. I lock the memory deep within me, a secret I carry with me whenever I gaze up at the stars. And so, even as I continue my routine of duty and surveillance in this vast, unpredictable world, I know that out there, somewhere beyond the reach of our instruments and explanations, lies a mystery that defies the mundane. I am forever changed by that encounter, a reminder that sometimes the universe speaks in a language of light and shadow, a language that, despite all our logic and science, remains forever just out of reach. Redditor 4. I've never told anyone this before, but I've grown up with a secret, a legacy of strange lights dancing over an old family fishing spot on the southwestern coast of Western Australia. For nearly a century, my family has whispered about bizarre UFOs, balls of purple and green light that speed through the night, hover silently above the water, and sometimes descend into the ocean as if drawn to its depths. My great-great-grandfather used to tell stories from the 1920s of people driving these lights across the sky, steering them like if they were automobiles in the heavens. To many in my family, these tales are as normal as a rainy day. They've been part of our lore for so long that most of us have learned not to react too wildly. But I, perhaps because I've seen these phenomena with my own eyes, feel a creeping, unshakable fascination and dread every time I step onto that weathered dock. I remember one summer night when I was a teenager, sitting on the edge of that dock with my old fishing rod in hand, staring out at the endless, starlit ocean. The air was cool and salty, carrying the distant cry of seabirds and the rhythmic lapping of waves. It was a perfect, peaceful night, the kind that makes you believe nothing bad could ever happen. And then, as if on cue, I saw them. 5 luminous orbs emerging from the darkness. They glowed with a sickly mix of purple and green, moving in a pattern that defied the usual randomness of fireflies or bioluminescent plankton. They weren't flickering. They were pulsing in deliberate unison, as though some unseen force was guiding their every motion. My heart raced as I watched them speed across the sky, their movements too precise to be natural. They moved like silent sentinels, appearing, hovering, and then disappearing into the inky blackness over the ocean. For a moment I thought I must be dreaming, an overactive imagination fueled by family legends. But the chill in the night air, the gentle slap of waves against the pier, and the weight of centuries-old stories bore witness to the reality of what I was seeing. I spent the rest of that night on the dock, unable to tear my eyes away from the spectacle. Every so often, one of the orbs would drop lower, as if teasing me, before shooting back up like a comet. I could almost feel its energy, a palpable charge in the air that made my skin tingle. The phenomenon lasted for what seemed like an eternity, though later I learned it was only about 15 minutes. When the lights finally faded, leaving the ocean and sky seemingly undisturbed, I sat there in a stunned silence, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. In the days that followed, I pored over old family journals and dusty photo albums, searching for clues. I found my great-great-grandfather's faded handwritten notes, describing the wandering balls that once lit up the night, driven across the sky by mysterious hands. His words were full of wonder and fear, a blend that resonated with the inexplicable beauty and terror of the experience. I began to believe that what I had witnessed wasn't a hoax or an elaborate prank. It was part of a phenomenon as old as our family's history at that fishing spot. Yet, despite the long legacy and my own first-hand encounters, I couldn't help but wonder if there was another explanation. Over the years, I'd researched every natural phenomenon I could think of: atmospheric plasma balls, electrical discharges, even rare bioluminescent events in the ocean. Some scientists have observed plasma phenomena that create swirling glowing spheres in the sky, but nothing seemed to quite match what I saw. These orbs were enormous, clearly defined, and moved with an intelligence that belied any natural accident. They weren't erratic sparks of lightning or the chaotic flicker of static electricity. They were methodical, almost mechanical. The more I tried to rationalize it, the more I began to suspect that there was a hidden intelligence behind their movements. My family's long history with these lights made me consider that perhaps we weren't witnessing alien visitors at all, but rather a natural, unexplained phenomenon, something that had existed long before we ever set foot on that dock. Still, there was something eerily purposeful about the way they glided over the ocean, as if they were surveying the horizon or, worse yet, communicating a message that we were too primitive to decipher. I remember one particularly stormy night a few years later. I had returned to the fishing spot, now abandoned by my family, but still holding a strange, magnetic pull for me. The wind was howling, and rain battered the weathered wooden planks of the dock. I was alone, wrapped in a threadbare jacket, staring out at the tumultuous sea, when I saw a solitary, pulsating orb of green light hovering just above the water. Its glow was both mesmerizing and sinister, casting eerie shadows on the churning waves. I felt an overwhelming sense of isolation and dread, as if the orb was a harbinger of something vast and unknowable. For a long, breathless minute, I watched it, unable to tear my eyes away. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the orb ascended and merged with the stormy sky, leaving no trace of its passage. I raced back to my car, my mind swirling with conflicting emotions, fear, wonder, and an inexplicable yearning to know more. When I got home, I locked the door behind me and sat in the dim light of my living room, my thoughts consumed by that solitary green orb. I tried to rationalize it away. Perhaps it was a projection from a satellite or a rare optical illusion brought on by the storm. But nothing made sense. That night, as I lay in bed with the sound of rain tapping against the window, I could still see the orb like a ghost etched into my memory. I realized then that I might never have all the answers, that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, haunting us in the quiet moments when we dare to look up at the sky. Even now, whenever I return to that old fishing spot, I find myself glancing up at the horizon with a mix of anticipation and unease. The vast, unchanging expanse of the ocean and sky holds its secrets tightly, and though my family has grown accustomed to the phenomenon, I can't help but feel that there's a story there, a story that stretches back 100 years, filled with wonder, fear, and the quiet acknowledgement that some lights in the sky are not meant to be understood. I've come to accept that while most UFO sightings can be explained by mundane occurrences, there are moments that defy rational explanation. The phenomenon at our family fishing spot is one of those rare mysteries. Whether it's a natural plasma event or evidence of something more intelligent, it remains a part of our legacy, a strange, shimmering memory that binds generations together in silent awe. And so, each time I walk along the weathered dock, I carry with me the weight of that mystery, the thrill of a secret shared by my ancestors, and the unsettling knowledge that, in the vastness of the universe, some lights remain forever unexplained. Redditor 5. I've never told anyone this before, but when I was 13, I experienced something at our family vacation in Minnesota that still haunts me. It was one of those warm, hazy summer nights by the lake. Quiet, almost serene. My family had rented a cabin out in the middle of nowhere, about a half-hour drive from the nearest town. The isolation was both comforting and eerie, and the lake was our favorite spot, a place passed down through generations where we'd come to fish, swim, and sometimes just sit quietly and let time slip away. That night, my older sister, then 24, was on the dock, absorbed in her phone, texting or maybe scrolling through some social media feed. I wasn't really paying much attention to her. I was in a small rowboat near the shore, bored and restless, watching the water ripple under the glow of the moon. I loved watching the fish below me. They'd dart away at the slightest ripple, though they never seemed to notice the objects I'd dropped from above. I found it amusing, in a childlike way, to see how the impact on the surface would send a shockwave, and then the fish would scatter in a synchronized, almost hypnotic dance. But this isn't about the fish. It was about what happened next. I remembered walking back to the dock after a while, and I saw something that made my heart pound. There, sitting at the end of an old, rusted boat near the shore, was an anchor-like object. It was heavy and metallic, a big, flat plate-like thing with a central pillar that, in our world, was normally tied to a rope. For a moment, I marveled at its design, thinking it looked too out of place to belong to any of the boats around here. Driven by a mix of curiosity and that inevitable recklessness of youth, I decided to drop it into the lake. I picked it up, feeling its cold, heavy surface in my hands, and then, without thinking much about the consequences, I released it, letting it plunge into the water. The moment I dropped it, I realized something was horribly wrong. The rope wasn't tied to anything. My initial thought was, oops, but that didn't prepare me for what happened next. Just a second after the anchor hit the water, I heard this rushing, thunderous noise, like the sound of the lake itself convulsing. I jumped in my boat and backed away, my eyes fixed on the spot where the anchor had sunk. Suddenly, the surface of the water began to churn violently. At first, it was subtle, a ripple here, a twitch there. But then, without warning, a massive plume of water erupted upward. It was like watching an inverted whirlpool burst forth, an enormous column of churning water shooting up from the lake as if the earth beneath had opened up. I was frozen, caught between terror and fascination. My body tensed, and I felt a cold sweat break out over my skin as the plume rose higher and wider, its roaring sound drowning out everything else. It was as if the very water was alive, reaching up with an unearthly force that I couldn't understand. I strained my eyes, trying desperately to see the source of the phenomenon, but all I could see was the chaotic swirl of water, illuminated by the moonlight in a ghostly glow. Then, out of nowhere, my sister came running from the dock, her face contorted with fear. She screamed at me to run, her voice piercing through the cacophony of the rushing water and my own panicked breaths. In that moment, all my thoughts were reduced to pure, instinctual terror. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my legs carrying me back to the safety of the cabin. Inside, I barely managed to catch my breath as I recounted the incident to my dad. My words tumbled out in a frantic rush. "Dad, you won't believe it. There was this massive, swirling column of water like nothing I've ever seen. It came up out of the lake right where I dropped that anchor, and it was huge." I expected him to be shocked, maybe even terrified like I was. Instead, his face hardened into an expression of annoyance. And before I could finish my story, he grabbed a paddle and gave me a spanking for lying. I was confused and hurt. How could he think I was making it up? But then I realized this wasn't the first time our family had encountered strange phenomena at this old fishing spot. After that day, we all returned to the lake. I insisted we go back, desperate to find any evidence of what I had seen. My sister and I scoured the shoreline, but apart from water collecting in odd patterns where it shouldn't have been, there was nothing to be found. The disturbance had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. Nobody believed me. To them, it was just a bizarre trick of nature. A gas pocket releasing suddenly, perhaps, or some freak optical illusion caused by the way the water refracted the moonlight. Years passed, and I often found myself haunted by that night. I would lie awake in the dark, my mind replaying the image of that inverted whirlpool, the roaring water, the palpable force that seemed to burst from the lake itself. I wondered, sometimes in hushed tones to myself, what on earth could have caused it? Did I accidentally open a gas pocket beneath the lake, unleashing a torrent of water and energy? Or, in a twist that still unsettles me, did I inadvertently awaken something ancient and powerful lurking beneath the surface? A creature or a force that was normally dormant, now roused by my careless act. I've spent countless hours researching, combing through old articles about unexplained phenomena and natural water vortexes, trying to find a rational explanation. Some scientists have observed plasma-like balls or unusual thermal events in lakes, but nothing exactly matched what I experienced that night. The formation was too sudden, too enormous, and far too controlled in its movement. It was as if the lake itself had become an instrument in a cosmic symphony, a dark, chaotic note played by nature, or something beyond nature. Over time, I also began to question whether my memory had distorted the event. Perhaps, I wondered, the whole thing was a fragment of a dream, a childhood hallucination, amplified by fear and the solitude of that remote place. I even asked my sister about her recollection, but she remembered it the same way, except she wasn't sure if she'd seen me drop the anchor. She didn't know how it all started, only that the phenomenon was real and that it towered over her, taller than she was. I was 13 then, so I knew it wasn't just my imagination. She confirmed the scale, even if the details remained a blur. Now, whenever I return to that old fishing spot, I feel a mix of nostalgia and dread. The dock is weathered and creaky, the water lapping softly against the shore under a sky that seems to hold too many secrets. I sometimes stand there for long minutes, listening to the gentle sounds of the lake, half expecting to see that massive, swirling plume emerge again. But it never does, except in the quiet corners of my mind, where memories flicker like distant, unreachable ghosts. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, accepting that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. My family has long whispered about strange lights and odd happenings at that spot, stories passed down for nearly 100 years. They say that even back in the 1920s, people claimed to see things moving in the sky, things that defied explanation. Perhaps what I witnessed was part of that legacy, a natural phenomenon, maybe a plasma ball, or something else entirely, that has haunted our family's history. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still feel a chill when I think back to that moment. The sound of breaking sticks, the rushing noise that signaled the birth of a massive, inverted whirlpool, and the overwhelming terror that propelled me to run back to safety. It reminds me that even in a place as seemingly ordinary as a family fishing spot, the universe can reveal its darker, more mysterious side in an instant. I'm not sure I'll ever uncover the true nature of what happened that night. Was it simply a freak geological event? A gas pocket erupting and creating a temporary vortex in the lake's surface? Or did my careless act disturb something ancient and enigmatic, a force that had lain dormant beneath the still waters for centuries? I'll probably never know for sure. And maybe, in some ways, that uncertainty is part of the terror. The unknown has a way of lingering, of seeping into the cracks of our everyday lives, reminding us that even the most mundane places can hide unfathomable secrets. So I carry that night with me, a memory of raw fear, wild wonder, and the bitter taste of regret for what I did. I still have the old rusted anchor in a dusty box somewhere in the attic, a relic of a moment when I unwittingly opened a door to the unknown. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the lake glimmers under the moonlight, I swear I can hear the faint echo of that rushing water. A whisper from a time when I was young, and the world was filled with mysteries that were just beyond my grasp. Redditor 6. I've never told anyone this before, but on the day of my grandfather's funeral, I experienced something that I still can't explain. I lived in rural Massachusetts, a place defined by miles of dense woodland interspersed with scattered suburban pockets. That morning, the air was crisp, and even though grief hung over me, I found solace wandering the familiar logging trails that my grandfather once used to walk. I was an avid mushroom collector even then, always slowing down to examine the small treasures that sprouted among the roots and ferns. Friends used to joke that I spent more time with fungi than with people, but I preferred the quiet companionship of nature. I remember that day clearly. I was walking down the old logging trail behind our family's property, my thoughts adrift between sorrow and the solace of the woods. My eyes, trained by years of mushroom hunting, were fixed on the forest floor as I scanned for a particularly striking whitecap mushroom. It was a cool, clear day, and the trail wound between towering pines and weathered oak trees. I stooped down, pulling out my small digital camera to capture a close-up of the delicate cap, its surface glistening with dew. I was so absorbed by that tiny marvel that I almost didn't notice the sound at first. Then, amid the rustling leaves and the distant creak of old timber, I heard it. A rhythmic thud, like the sound of someone with heavy, fleshy knuckles punching a solid tree. At first, I assumed it was just a deer stomping around, perhaps protecting its young, or maybe even a bear testing its territory. I had heard the deep, resonant stomps of moose, the sharp snapping crashes of antlers, and the thudding tread of bears before, but this sound was different. It was methodical, persistent, thud, 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 and it went on for what felt like minutes, its pace unchanging, almost hypnotic. Curiosity mixed with a sudden surge of adrenaline forced me to stop in my tracks. My heart pounded in my ears and cold sweat broke out along my neck as I slowly rose to look up. I glanced upward through the gaps in the dense canopy. Through the well-trimmed trees of my grandfather's land, I could see clearly for about 75 to 100 yards, but nothing was there. No deer, no bear, no figure moving among the shadows. The only sound was that relentless, rhythmic thudding coming from deeper within the woods. In a moment of impulsive defiance against the terror building in my chest, I let out a whistle, a sharp, piercing note that couldn't possibly be mistaken for any bird call. Almost immediately, I heard a low, quick whistle back. I froze. My mind raced. It must be some asshole loggers scouting the land past the no trespassing gate, I thought, trying to rationalize the sound. But the rhythm was too perfect, too deliberate, and it set my heart hammering even harder. Ignoring the voice in my head that whispered for me to run, I yelled, "Hey!" as loudly as I could muster, hoping to draw some kind of response or perhaps scare off whatever was causing the sound. The reply was instant. Whatever it was, it bolted away faster than any two-legged creature I'd ever heard run. I could clearly tell it wasn't a four-legged animal. I knew the sound of a dog, a deer, even a moose on the run, and this was different. The steps were frantic and heavy, echoing through the woods with a terrifying urgency, and I'm 100% certain it moved on two legs. The pace was such that I'd never imagined a two-legged creature, probably weighing at least 250 pounds, could run that fast. My blood ran cold. The feeling was surreal, like something out of a horror movie. A creature too large and too unnatural to be a man, yet moving with the swift, desperate energy of a predator. I stood there on the logging trail, every nerve on high alert, the sound of its retreating footsteps fading into the rustling of the leaves. I didn't know what to think. I was still mourning my grandfather, and the weight of his absence mingled with the raw terror of what I'd just witnessed. I ran all the way back to the house, my breaths coming in ragged gasps, my mind a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. When I burst through the door, panting and disoriented, I recounted everything to my dad. I told him about the rhythmic thudding, the whistle, and the monstrous two-legged figure that had outrun my desperate shout. My words tumbled out in a frantic rush, but my father only looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and irritation. He didn't believe me. He dismissed it as a child's overactive imagination stirred by the somber mood of my grandfather's funeral. Worse still, he accused me of lying about the incident, and before I knew it, I was on the receiving end of a spanking with the old paddle. An attempt to silence my story and, perhaps, my fear. That night, I lay in my bed, the small room echoing with my rapid, uneven breaths. I couldn't shake the image of those bright, heavy footsteps and that dreadful whistle that had returned a low, mocking reply. The woods outside, once a source of solace during my mushroom hunts, now seemed to pulse with a hidden menace. I lay awake, wondering what kind of creature could produce such a sound, a creature that defied every natural explanation I had ever known. Over the following days, I avoided the logging trail, sticking close to the house. But the memory lingered, an unyielding specter that haunted my dreams. I began to research local legends and cryptid sightings, trying to piece together a rational explanation. Some folks in the area whispered about a creature, a sort of Bigfoot with a spiritual connection to the woods, roaming the dense forest between the scattered suburban pockets. Others claimed it was nothing more than a misidentified human, or a particularly agile hiker in the dark. But none of those explanations satisfied me. I was convinced that what I heard that day was something much larger, something that could only be described as a silent terror lurking just beyond the edges of human understanding. Years have passed since that day, and I've grown up, but I still find myself looking over my shoulder whenever I walk by the woods near our house. I've tried to forget it, to rationalize it away as just a fluke of nature or the product of a frightened mind, but the memory remains stubbornly vivid. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind rustles through the trees, I swear I hear the sound of heavy footsteps. Thud, 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 echoing softly in the distance, and I'm transported back to that moment on the logging trail, feeling that same paralyzing dread all over again. I've never shared my story with many people, partly because my dad's reaction has always been to dismiss it as childish fancy. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I recall the exact look in his eyes, the mix of skepticism and hidden fear, as if he, too, had once encountered something inexplicable in those dark woods. And so every time I pass by that old trail, I can't help but wonder, what if that creature, whatever it was, still roams the woods, watching from the shadows, waiting for another opportunity to reveal itself? I still have nightmares about that night. In them, I see the dense, impenetrable darkness of the woods, the sound of leaves crunching under enormous, heavy footsteps, and the sudden, piercing whistle that breaks the silence. I wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, with the image of those two bright, unblinking eyes, so large, so eerie, staring back at me from the darkness. It's a memory that no amount of time or rational explanation can erase. Even now, whenever a chill runs down my spine or I hear a distant, rhythmic thud, I remember that day on the logging trail in rural Massachusetts. I remember the terror, the urgency, and the undeniable feeling that I was being watched by something far beyond my understanding, a creature that defied simple explanation and left me forever changed. And though I've tried to put it behind me, I know that deep in the heart of those ancient woods, the truth still lurks, waiting silently for the moment it chooses to reveal itself again. Redditor 7. I've never told anyone this before, but when I was a young teen on a 4-day canoeing trip with my friends in the remote southeast, something happened that still sends chills down my spine. It was one of those trips where everything felt alive. The whisper of the wind through ancient trees, the gentle lapping of water against our canoes, and the night sky so vast and full of secrets that it made you believe the world was far bigger than you'd ever imagined. It was late one night, after we'd built a roaring bonfire and spent hours goofing off and sharing stories, our youthful laughter echoing into the darkness. The fire had dwindled down to glowing coals, and we found ourselves sitting in a circle, our faces lit only by the soft, fading light and the silver glow of the full moon. I was in the back of one canoe, drifting lazily near the shore, lost in my own thoughts, when something caught my ear. A distant, high-pitched scream slicing through the still night air. For a moment, the sound startled us all, a brief interruption to our easy conversation. We exchanged nervous glances, each of us wondering if it was merely the wind or an animal in distress. But as quickly as it came, the scream faded into the background, and our chatter resumed. We almost forgot about it as we lost ourselves in the camaraderie of the moment. Then, a while later, as we sat around the dying embers of our fire, one of my friends suddenly pointed toward the opposite bank of the river. "Guys, what is that?" he asked, his voice trembling with equal parts curiosity and dread. We all turned our eyes toward the dark silhouette framed by the trees. There, illuminated by the full moon, was a massive, vague shape. A huge, dark figure standing motionless, watching us. It was difficult to make out details, but its presence was undeniable. I remember feeling a mix of shock and an indescribable fear that crept up my spine. I stared, frozen, as if that shape were a specter from another world. It was so faint that for a moment I thought it might be a trick of the light or a tree swaying in the breeze. But as the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, the figure remained, its outline stark against the pale lunar light. The silence that fell over our little group was palpable, each of us holding our breath in unspoken terror. Unable to shake the uneasy feeling, we scrambled for flashlights. We ran back to one of our friend's cars and grabbed his dad's set, our trembling hands fumbling with the switches in our haste. Once we returned to the spot, we shone our beams onto the figure. Under the harsh glare, something unexpected happened. The parts of the figure where the light hit began to glow red, a subtle but chilling hue that contrasted sharply with the cool moonlight. The red reflection made it seem as if the creature were alive, its eyes burning with some otherworldly intensity. We stood there, huddled together on the riverbank, watching as the figure, silent and deliberate, slowly began to move. It walked up along an embankment, its movements measured and unhurried, as if it were unsure of its own purpose. Then, just as silently, it turned and disappeared into the dark woods beyond. The abrupt vanishing act left us all rooted to the spot in a state of disbelieving shock. That night, we eventually made our way back to the camp in a stunned, silent procession. The usual joviality of our trip had been replaced by a heaviness that none of us could shake. In the days that followed, while we tried to resume our normal activities, the memory of that figure lingered like a shadow at the edge of our vision. At the family reunion later that year, even though we rarely talked about it and everyone pretended nothing had happened, I could feel the shared, unspoken terror among us, a secret that bonded us in a way nothing else could. I've always been a rational person, the kind who doesn't believe in ghost stories or myths, but that night on the river forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about the world. I spent countless nights replaying the scene in my mind, each detail as clear as if it were happening again. The sound of that high-pitched scream, the soft glow of the dying embers, the stark, red-tinted light reflecting off that mysterious figure. It all haunted me relentlessly. Even now, when I walk by quiet lakes or hear the rustle of leaves on a still night, I remember that moment and wonder what exactly we had seen. Over the years, I've tried to research similar sightings. I came across accounts of strange, inexplicable figures appearing near bodies of water, some even described as otherworldly guardians of sacred places. I learned that certain natural phenomena can sometimes create illusions, where shadows and reflections merge into forms that defy ordinary explanation. But nothing I read could fully capture the terror I felt that night, the sense that something very real and very alien had been watching us from the darkness. I've grown up since then, and the memory has softened into a bittersweet echo of youth, a mix of fear, wonder, and regret for not understanding it then. Yet every time I pass by that same lake, or when a full moon rises over a quiet wooded area, I feel that old familiar chill. I still get goosebumps thinking about the way our flashlights illuminated that figure, revealing just enough of its red, eerie glow to convince me it was more than just a trick of the light. Even though we never found concrete evidence and my family dismissed the experience as an overactive imagination spurred by grief and youthful curiosity, I know what I saw. It's become a part of who I am, a reminder that sometimes the world hides secrets in the most unassuming places. In the vast expanse of the wilderness, where the ordinary rules of nature are suspended, something extraordinary can happen, a fleeting glimpse of the unknown that changes you forever. And so, even after all these years, I find myself drawn to those quiet, mysterious places. I still go on solitary hikes, exploring the edges of dense woods and remote lakes, always keeping an eye out for something that defies explanation. I've learned to live with that lingering sense of unease, that persistent awareness that beneath the surface of our everyday reality, there may be something else watching, something that waits in the dark to remind us that the universe is far more mysterious than we dare to believe. That night on the lake remains etched in my memory, a moment of pure, unadulterated terror and wonder, a secret shared by a group of young boys who once believed in the magic of the wilderness. I carry it with me, not as a burden, but as a constant reminder that even in the most peaceful settings, the unknown is never far away. And whenever I hear a distant scream in the night or see a flicker of red in the corner of my eye, I can't help but remember that night and the silent figure that walked away into the woods, leaving us with a story that will never truly die. Redditor 8. I've never told anyone this before, but I still remember that long, arid drive across the South Australian outback like it was yesterday. I live in Australia, a place where the idea of wild big cats is dismissed as pure myth. Yet one scorching afternoon, I encountered something that shattered every rational expectation I had. I was driving with my friend who was napping in the back seat, along a desolate highway that cut through vast, barren landscapes. The sun was high, and the heat shimmered on the asphalt, making the world seem to vibrate with an eerie intensity. I was alone at the wheel, the monotonous hum of the engine and the whisper of wind through the open windows my only companions, when something out of the corner of my eye made me slow down. There, emerging from a scraggly thicket of scrubby bushes by the roadside, was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen. A sleek black panther, its glossy coat reflecting the harsh sunlight. It was impossibly out of place here, in the wild, sun-baked plains of Australia, where, according to everyone I'd ever heard, no such big cats roamed. For a split second, time seemed to slow. I remember my heart pounding in my ears, my hands tightening around the steering wheel as I stared in disbelief. The creature moved with a graceful, almost predatory ease. It stopped and looked directly at the car, its eyes glinting like obsidian in the bright light, as if studying me with a cold, deliberate curiosity. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it turned and bolted back into the bush, vanishing among the twisted branches and scrub. I fumbled with the pedals, my mind racing. Did I just see that? I wondered. I glanced over at my friend in the back, hoping he'd rouse and confirm what my eyes had witnessed. I nudged him, shaking him gently, but he remained lost in a deep sleep until I had practically screamed his name. When he finally stirred, he rubbed his eyes and looked out the window. "What did you see?" he mumbled, still groggy. I tried to explain the sleek black shape, the piercing gaze, the way it moved like a shadow slipping back into darkness, but his eyes widened, and he just muttered something about me probably seeing things, that I was either imagining it or pulling a prank. For weeks afterward, that image haunted me. I couldn't shake the memory of those intense eyes and the fluid, silent grace of that beast. I researched online and talked to locals whenever I could muster the courage, and to my astonishment, I discovered that I wasn't alone. Several people in West Australia claim to have seen similar creatures lurking in the remote bushland wild. Inexplicable sightings dismissed by most as folklore, legends passed down through families. Still, the very thought of it unsettled me. I wasn't sure whether I had truly seen a living, breathing panther or if my mind had conjured it up in a moment of intense stress and isolation. It wasn't just the sight of the creature, though, that left me rattled. The incident took place on one of those long, endless drives through the outback, where the landscape is so vast and empty that every sound is magnified. The wind whistled through the scrub, and every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, sent a shudder down my spine. I remember thinking that if a creature like that could appear out of nowhere, what else might be hiding in the endless void of the bush? After the drive, I kept replaying the moment over and over. I remembered every detail, the way the creature's coat shimmered with a deep black sheen against the golden light, the calculated way it looked back at the car, almost as if it was sizing me up, and then how it melted away into the wild. I told my family the story, but their reaction was a mix of amusement and disbelief. My friend, who had slept through it all, insisted I was either making it up or losing my mind. I tried to convince them, but in our small town, such things were met with raised eyebrows and polite dismissals. In quiet moments, I would drive the same roads, hoping to catch a glimpse of that mysterious creature again. The further I drove away from the familiar, the more I felt the stark isolation of the outback. At night, the dark silhouettes of the bush seemed to pulse with hidden life. I began to notice sounds that I hadn't before, the low growl in the distance, the rustle of leaves that didn't quite match the wind. I'd slow down, heart pounding, eyes scanning the darkness, but nothing ever emerged again. Still, the memory of that encounter remains as vivid as ever. I started documenting everything, scribbling in a battered notebook I kept in my glove compartment. I wrote down the time, the exact location, later looked up on a map, and every detail of that day. I even took to researching local legends and folklore about mysterious big cats in Australia, finding hints of old tales that had been passed down from one generation to the next. Some claimed that during times of great change or strife, mysterious beasts would appear, as if heralding a shift in the balance of nature. I couldn't say if that was true, but it offered a sliver of explanation that made the experience feel almost fated, like a myth in the making. Despite my internal turmoil, I tried to lead a normal life. I went to work, returned home, and even drove through the bush without incident for months. Yet, every so often, when I was alone at night and the wind was just right, I would catch a glimpse of something dark moving between the trees. My hands would grip the steering wheel a little tighter, and I'd feel that same rush of adrenaline, as if I were back on that desolate road, facing that terrifying, inexplicable sight once more. I have learned not to speak of it too openly. Those who know me often label me the crazy outback guy or dismiss my stories as mere flights of fancy. I fear that if I share too much, people will think I'm unhinged, and yet the truth of that encounter is etched in my mind. A silent, persistent reminder that in a land where big cats are supposed to be mere myth, sometimes the impossible becomes all too real. Every now and then, I find myself returning to that same stretch of road in my thoughts. I recall the sensation of being utterly alone, the vast emptiness of the outback stretching before me, and the sudden, heart-stopping moment when a pair of luminous eyes met mine through the windshield. I can still remember the sound of my own ragged breaths, the way my pulse thumped so loudly I thought it might echo across the barren landscape. I sometimes wonder what that creature was. Was it a wild animal, a descendant of some ancient lineage that managed to survive in secret? Or was it something else entirely, an anomaly, a remnant of a time when the earth was wilder, or perhaps even a visitor from another realm? The questions haunt me, and I know I may never get the answers I seek, but that's the terrifying beauty of it. The mystery endures, a shadow that looms over my memories like a dark omen. Now, as I sit here reflecting on that day, I can still feel the chill that ran through my body, the weight of the silence after it disappeared into the bushes. I try to convince myself that most UFO sightings have mundane explanations, but sometimes when I drive along a lonely outback road under a starlit sky, I wonder if perhaps there are things in the world that defy explanation. And in those moments, I feel both a sense of awe and a paralyzing fear that I'll see that creature again. A silent, spectral guardian of the wilderness, forever part of the myth and mystery of rural Australia.